Thank you, sir.
Stand up if you've done Chaucer already. I just want to know, like, okay. So if I want to ask fearsome questions, I point them this way. And nice, easy questions this way, right? So you don't know anything about it at all. Okay. Because you have to adjust what you say to those who are listening to you, which I think Chaucer knew. All right, well, your text, general prologue, which you people know, is Chaucer's introduction to a set of tales that he wrote, which we now call the Canterbury Tales. And he imagined a set of pilgrims, Christian pilgrims, setting out from London and going 60 miles over 3-4 days to Canterbury, where there was a shrine of a holy saint, St. Thomas. And Chaucer himself imagines himself on this pilgrimage, and he meets with all the other pilgrims at a kind of hotel in Southwark, in just outside London in those days, where he joins up with the party. And then he describes each and every one of the pilgrims in the group, and he says there were 9 and 20, and 2 or 3 he doesn't describe, would bring it up to 32. And he is one of them. And what he has done is he's taken characters from different ranks in society. As many critics will tell you, not the very highest rank like a king or something like that, or a duke or an earl or a lord, but the lower end of the aristocracy, the knight, is the highest ranking person on the pilgrimage. And he comes with his son, who is a squire. And a squire in those days meant a kind of well-born gentleman at court, learning how to serve those who were lords and dukes and kings and so on in a palace or a lordly house. Then there are other kinds of characters, religious characters. It was a Christian country, it was a Catholic country, Protestantism had not been heard of, and I think 1 in every 7 or 8 people in the country would have been a religious person of some kind, that is in the church, right? Everybody went to church, but if you wanted to be more religious, you would be a priest, a parish priest, looking after your church and the society around, congregation. You could join a religious order and become a monk and live apart from society, attached to an abbey, and remove yourself from the world and devote your life to many prayers and services during the day, and perhaps to some kind of work like copying out holy books or something like that. You could be a nun, different kinds of nuns. They also removed themselves from society and lived apart in a convent and followed a rule. And all of those clergy who followed a rule were called regular clergy. Regular means following a rule. And they had to take a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And their idea was that they served society by their prayers and meditation rather than by doing ordinary work in society or getting money from it or getting rich or something like that. Okay? So there are religious characters. But what Chaucer has also done is he's put representative figures from many other different areas in society. So he has a merchant, he has a clerk, which means a scholar, a student at Oxford, probably heading towards being an academic. He has a doctor, he has a sergeant at law, which is a very senior kind of a barrister or lawyer. And he has a captain, a shipman, and he has a woman, one secular woman who is not a religious. There is one religious woman who is a prioress, a kind of nun, and there is one secular woman outside the religious clergy who is a married woman, a wife. And her expertise is in weaving. She's a craftswoman, she's a businesswoman, and she seems to make a business out of marrying many times, because she says, husbands at church door, I have had 5. And she says in another place, welcome the 6th, whenever that he shall. So it's a different society from India, where you wouldn't have widow remarriage to that extent that was quite common in England. And the reason is because the widows had a system of keeping 1/3 of the property. The husbands used to sign a jointure or a deed when they got married, and 1/3 of the property coming from the husband's side of the family remained with the wife if he died. And you would die in 4 or 5 years, because it was not a very healthy society. There was plague, there was disease, there was not much medical care. So marriages didn't last like they do now, 25, 30 years, maybe 5, 6 years, 7 years. So then the widow would be there with the money. So then somebody would come along and want to marry. So that's how the wife has got all her money. So Chaucer shows these people, and some critics say, is this a work which is trying to show a cross-section of English society at that time? And it leaves out those who were higher up in the scale, above the knight, and it leaves out those below the ploughman, the peasant, who would not have had enough money to go on a pilgrimage. But for the section that Chaucer takes, he has a representative number of characters. So the people are intended to represent their estate or degree in society. So we have to think what their society was like. And Chaucer's society was still a medieval society, and the medieval system was a feudal system originally. And a feudal system describes a society where all land is technically the king's, and the king allows land to people below him in return for expecting their duty and service to him. So this had happened in the time of William the Conqueror, 1066, and William came in from France, he conquered England, he's the king with all the land, and then dukes and lords hold land from the king and are expected to return that value in service. Like the land would help you provide so many armed horsemen. The king wants to go to war somewhere, he calls upon you to provide 20 armed horsemen. Because he's given you the land, you have to provide the horsemen. So it's a system originally set up not on a kind of capitalist ownership of property where the land was owned by you entirely for you to buy and sell as you wished. It was not thought of like that. It was thought of as being allowed to you in return for your service. And this went all the way down the scale to the village level, where the lord of the manor, he was called, was a big lord, and he owned the village. And all the villagers were probably not free, they were like bonded labor. And the word for that in Chaucer is villain. It's the same word villain, meaning the crook or a criminal, but in those days it just meant a low-class person, like a serf or an unfree laborer. And these villagers would hold strips of land. In most parts of England, you've got strips of land in the village from the lord, as it were, and a richer one might have, or a wealthier, well-off one might have several strips of land, a poorer one might have less. It was not equal. And you worked on the land, and from the produce that you grew on that land, you had to give to the lord of the manor. And if the lord of the manor needed some ploughing to be done, or some hay cutting to be done, or any other agricultural work, you had to give him days of service. So the feudal system is a system where you have to do the work that is required of your degree or level in society, and you owe service to somebody above you, and it's a sort of pyramidal structure like that, and everybody has these duties or obligations to the person above. And it's a little bit like a caste system in that you are fixed in your degree, and it's not expected that you move out of it. So that is the sort of original setup, simplified way of putting it. By the time Chaucer is writing, and we think the general prologue is 1387 is the date that they give to it, this has begun to break down, and a lot of economic change has come in. And when you get economic change, you get people's ideas changing and people having to readjust and think things through and so on, and that can give rise to a lot of interesting literature. So we have to think of this text as coming out of a period of change. Okay. Just to give you an idea of the numbers in England, there would have been in Chaucer's period about 3.5 million people in the whole of England. I don't know how many you have in Kerala, but probably not many times more than that. I don't know. It's quite small in the numbers. About 150 lords, about 2,000 knights, about 50,000 people in the church as monks or nuns or priests, about 30 or 40,000 who were not knights but ordinary gentry, quite well born, owning land in some way. Maybe 100 or 150,000, that is 1 lakh, 1.5 lakhs, lived in towns. And it was called a town if it had 3,000-4,000 people in it, so it was quite tiny. And the total 3.5 million. Now what's happening to society is that instead of this concept of loyalty and service, which the feudal system kind of teaches everybody, is that you are getting a shift from that to cash payment and a kind of more commercial type economy, more close to what we have now. For example, because of a big outbreak of the plague, you've heard of this? There was a big outbreak of the plague that came in on ships, possibly from Asia, but then it reached Europe, and then it came on the ships to England. How did it come on ships? Ships are full of rats. Rats have fleas on them. The fleas carry the disease from the rat and come and bite some human being, and then you catch the plague. So this is how it spread. And in 1348, there was an outbreak of this plague in 1993, somewhere in India, not far from Delhi. So it was very useful for teaching Chaucer because the newspapers were full of how the symptoms of the plague, what they looked like and so on. It was usually fatal. It was usually fatal. And you got these sort of black swellings under your armpits and sweats and fevers, and they had no idea how to deal with it. And it arises from not bathing, unhygienic conditions, fleas in your blankets and so forth, you know, the way that they lived in those days. It killed 40% of those people in England, a huge number. Some people say even half the people in England, right? So it disrupts society enormously. And if the population begins to build up a little bit and the plague comes again because it kept coming back, then again it ruins the economy. So you have this big effect. Now, imagine you're a lord of the manor in a village and you're used to have, let's say, 150 villagers who could come and work on your land. And they're all dead or sick. And now you have only 25 villagers, right? And they can easily refuse to work and you're stuck. And so what happened was that the poor peasants began to, or if they were fed, given food, better quality food. And if the lord was not able to give it, some other desperate lord in the next village would be willing to do it. So the Black Death helped those peasants who survived to demand higher wages and also encourage them to do what was not allowed, move to other places where they could find someone who would pay them higher wages. So that it changed the balance of power a little bit so that the peasants could demand a better standard of living. And then they would get free of the laws which said you have to stay on the land of your lord, you have to serve him and so forth, and they could become more mobile. Geographically they could move, and economically they might go up a bit. So mobile in two ways. Similarly, if you were higher up the scale and you were, say, a knight who held land from a lord, enough to provide him with horses and military equipment and so on, so that he could fight if necessary. Originally, the idea was you fought for so many days for your lord, whenever he demanded. That becomes inconvenient, because supposing the lord wants a 2-year campaign fighting in Europe, but you only owe him 40 days. You can't go all the way to Europe, which takes a long time, and say 40 days is up, now I'm going home. You know, it's not flexible. So knights used to be able to either buy their freedom from this duty, which was called scutage. They paid a fine and got out of doing this military duty, or it was better for the captain leading the army to pay them. So you got money wages coming in instead of just work, service. So money comes in there. Money comes in the towns where there are obviously markets and craftsmen and things like that, and the towns were kind of isolated from the feudal system because people were more free in the towns. Free to move where the work was, free to get wages for doing this and that. Okay? So there were phrases like, a proverb of the time, in Chaucer's time, city air maketh free. You could escape the hierarchical structure of society and the restrictions on movement and labor and so on. If you escaped to a city and you stayed there for 1 year and 1 day, like in a fairy tale, a year and a day, you were a free man. You were no longer a villain. And a modern historian has called cities and towns non-feudal islands in a feudal sea. And towns were able to get charters or sort of licenses of liberty from the king in return for money. So you would say, king, you need lots of money, you need cash for some war, something like that. Come in. Give us the freedom in such and such a town, Colchester or whatever town. We'll pay an annual fixed sum to the king, and in return we get freedom. So you can see that in respect of towns, in respect of peasant laborers, and in respect of knights, the old duties are falling away, the old restrictions are falling away, and a kind of monetary deal or relationship is set up instead. Okay, so that brings a change in society towards more mobility, geographically, up in society, and accumulation of money. Then you have the church, and large numbers of people in the church, the ideology of the church, the ideas of the church being spread. How? How did the church get its ideas across to the people? 80-90% of the people are peasants. How does the church get its ideas across to the people if they are peasants? It has to be oral, spoken word. Where would that happen? In the church, in the sermon which the priest gives during the Sunday service, he would speak, I think, in English and preach to the people, just on the Sunday services. Otherwise, the people who could not read had to look at the stories from the Christian Bible in the church windows in the colored glass, and they would have maybe plays. You will learn about, when you do English literature, the mystery plays that used to be put on. This was part of a movement to get religious ideas across to the people. Otherwise, you could not, even if you could read, you could not easily access information about your own religion. Because the Bible was in what language? Guess. Latin. The Bible was in Latin. St. Jerome, he had translated the whole thing. You had to go to Oxford or Cambridge, the two universities that were there at that time, and you had to learn Latin through grammar school, and then at Oxford and Cambridge, then you could become a priest, and then you could read the Bible in Latin. But the ordinary person had no access to his own written religion, as it were, because it was in Latin. Okay? About 40 years before the general prologue, in the 1330s, 1340s, even if you went to school, you were English boy, not girl. Girls didn't go to school. And your school teaching might either be in Latin or it would teach you French, because England had been conquered by the Norman French from 1066, William the Conqueror, and most formal activity, language activity, was in either French or Latin. Yeah? The court, where Chaucer went as a young boy, as a page, and then he became an esquire, a sort of gentleman, civil servant type person, assistant in the palace. And there was a court society of knights, lords, ladies, the king, and so forth. The court would often speak in French. It did not shift to using English until the very end of the 1300s. Other writers at Chaucer's time, like Gower, who was 10 years older, who was a poet at the court in London, he wrote in Latin, one poem, in French, one poem, and only his latest one, addressed to King Richard II, has a Latin title, Confessio Amantis, but it is in English. So we have interesting things here. Chaucer, when he goes to court, he could have easily decided to write in French. That would have been the literary culture at the court at the time. The lords and ladies would understand French. Okay? By that time in the English schools, the boys were not learning French so well, and the teachers were complaining they don't know any more French than their left heel. You know, they insist on speaking English all the time. We should forbid it. We should make them learn French. There was obviously a move away towards the native language of the people. Right? Now, wouldn't this change dialogue, debate, intellectual activity in the country if there is a shift towards using the language that my husband recommended, you know, your own language, because then you are more at home and you can begin to deal with ideas. Whereas if all the cultural activity in your country has been the elite controlling it, right? Latin would be used by the church and French maybe by the court and the law courts. Until 1362, I think they said you can hear the legal cases in English, not in French. You would write down the law, the judge's orders and all that in Latin. Shifting to the vernacular, the actual language people spoke, is very important, I think. And people said you should be able to read the Bible in your own language. Men and women who can read. There wouldn't have been that many women who could read, but let them also read the Bible. And who is saying this? A person who got labeled as a heretic and a radical and a dangerous man? Feeling that people should be able to read the scriptures for themselves. He embarked on a translation of the Bible into English. And he had an assistant called John Purvey, I think. When Wycliffe died, which was 1384, John Purvey continued with the translation. And the translation, I looked at it. There's a Christian library in Delhi quite near where St. Stephen's College is, and I went there and I found an edition which has Wycliffe's Bible in the English of that time, with all the old spelling and everything. Now, other people did not think this was a good idea. Education and being able to discuss and debate and read in your own language can be dangerous for the authorities, right? So the authorities in the church started to accuse Wycliffe of heresy, and he was hauled up by the Bishop of London. And then there were letters from the Archbishop to Oxford University saying, how are you allowing these guys to preach? They should not be saying these kind of things. And there was an attempt to clamp down on the debates and issues being raised by Wycliffe. I won't say all of the things that Wycliffe first started to talk about, but he was criticizing the church of his time, which had become very wealthy and in charge of huge tracts of land in the country and big cathedrals and bishops' palaces and so on, a lot of wealth. And Wycliffe was attacking the wealth of the church and also the way in which the church used to play on the simple beliefs of the people to get money. Pilgrimages. You persuade the people that it's important for their religious life to travel far to a holy place, and that only by going there will they have a chance of going to heaven. They believe you, they spend money, they give money to the shrine when they get there, and it goes into the pocket of the church, according to Wycliffe. And he felt that this was not a good practice. Isn't it interesting that there was a criticism of pilgrimages in the same period that Chaucer writes a set of people who are on a pilgrimage? And Chaucer shows you, are they all going for religious purpose? Is it not making money for the tavern keepers and the hotel keepers on the way? Is the wife of Bath not going there because she's already gone through 5 husbands? She needs to meet another one? What is the reason for each of the pilgrims to go on the pilgrimage? Is it a worldly reason? Is it a holiday, picnic? Or is it with full devout courage, with true religious feeling, as Chaucer claims he had himself as he joined the group? So Chaucer raises the question about pilgrimages in a period where others are debating whether such things are a good practice in the church. So I'm trying to show to you that it can be a radical just to make you think about the question of, say, pilgrimages, let alone all the other religious characters in this text who seem to be more interested in money than in their religious devotion. MA students who've read the text, can you think of any religious character in this book who is interested in making money? I'm just putting the names of the religious characters and you tell me which one you think has any relationship with making money. These are the characters on the pilgrimage whom in critical books and so on are lumped together as ecclesiastics, to do with the church. I'm putting brackets around the summoner, whose job was to summons you to the archdeacon's court, which was a church court, if you had committed adultery or going around with a young woman when you shouldn't be, or hadn't paid your tithes, your taxes to the church, or something like that. So he's more like a legal official attached to the court than a religious person himself, but he's connected closely to the church. Otherwise, all of these are something to do with the church. Now, do you remember any of them making money? Or being rich? Living a fine lifestyle? What was the vow that you took if you were a monk or a nun? In the college where I taught, sometimes in the class there'd be 7 nuns. So I would ask them, what is the vow that you have taken? You're all becoming nuns. And they would remember it. I always forget to close this. Poverty. This was the ideal for a person who devoted themselves to the religious life. You take a vow, you live according to the rule, you are regular clergy, monk or nun or friar, because you follow the rule. Right? You have got monk, prioress, friar, and these are all people who have taken this vow because they are regular. That comes from a Latin word meaning rule. The parson is secular, he's out in the world, he lives in the village among his parishioners, and he is taking Christianity to the ordinary people. He's in the world. These ones are supposed to be away from the world, except this one who wanders about preaching more like a sadhu, because he can roam from place to place and give sermons at any village corner. Now, I asked the students in my Christian college in Delhi, which one is the toughest? That's the one they said was the toughest to keep. What is he interested in? Hunting. He had full many a dainty horse in stable. He does not believe in the old rule which says a monk out of his cloister, his enclosed convent, is like a fish out of water. He believes in going out on his horses. Therefore, he was a precursor arit. Therefore, he was a hunter. He did not like the rule. Therefore, he went in for hunting. And we are told fur around the, trimming the edge of his sleeves, keep nice and warm. He has supple boots, not monkish sandals. In other words, his prosperity, the lifestyle he is living, is like that of a rich country gentleman. The bridle on his horse's head has bells on it. We are told that they jingle more loudly than the chapel bell. The chapel bell is saying, time for service, come to prayer. And the bells on the horse's bridle are saying, let's go hunting. And which does he do? Chaucer doesn't say, but you can guess. So you have the wealth and easy lifestyle of the church with him. What you do not have is anybody suffering because he's exploiting or cheating them. You don't have a victim. Remember this, because in other satires of Chaucer's time, called estate satires, they similarly took a monk, a lawyer, a doctor, a knight, etc., and they showed you how the bad ones of these types were hurting society by oppressing or victimizing people. So they contrasted the ideal version of what that person should do to contribute to the whole, and the negative if he was doing something negative, right? Chaucer is building on that pattern, but he's altering it in some ways. Okay, do you remember anything about her? The first thing we hear about her is that her smiling was full, simple and coy, I think. Then we hear all about her polite table manners and how she reached very delicately to get the meat from her dish. She didn't drop any grease anywhere, right? When she drank, she didn't leave any mark on the cup and so on. And she kept some little dogs, and she fed the dogs on the best white bread when every peasant in the country would be eating black bread made of rye, which is actually healthier, but they didn't know that then. So lifestyle, luxury, all her tender heart and conscience directed towards her dogs, especially if a man beat it with a stick. Nothing said about her sympathy for the poor or for the sick human beings or anything like that. So criticism implied, but no victim really. What about him? He associates all with rich and sellers of vitail. He keeps company with the rich people in the town and those who sell food. Not because he can get a free dinner, though I'm sure he does, but because they belong to the highest sectors of town society, because the guilds of those who sold food were powerful ones. And worthy women of the town. And he butters up the women, and he gets contributions. For everywhere he goes to preach, he gets contributions. And he has to pay his order, or the order of friars to which he belongs. He has to pay a certain amount to be licensed to beg for money for the church in a certain area. That's his patch, as it were. He's a limiteur. He has this patch. And obviously he says, I'll give you to the church, I'll give you 20 shillings a week or whatever he could collect. He gets much more than that. Where does the surplus go? Presumably into his pocket. So Chaucer shows you a man who is supposed to be living in poverty according to Saint Francis, who was one of the saints who started off friars, who's supposed to preach God's word going on foot with a begging bowl in poverty here and there, and he's supposed to contribute all that he collects to the church body behind him. And we have a person who dismisses the lepers and the beggars of the town, it says so in the text, associates only with the rich, and his purchase was well better than his rent. It's a line that means what he collected was a lot more than what he paid to the church. So he's profiteering. Okay? So what we are getting in Chaucer's pictures of the ecclesiastical characters is a neglect of duty, a lack of any responsibility towards society as a whole, whereas the old feudal idea had been whatever your rank in society, each one contributes. The peasants are like the feet of the body, right? The knights who fight are like the arms of the body, and so on. Everybody contributes. But we get in Chaucer a picture of a society where even the religious ones are not contributing. They're just taking. And money. This guy, the pardoner, he goes around the country with a bag full of relics. That is, bits of cloth from the Virgin Mary gown, or bones of some dead saint, or any holy thing, or supposedly holy thing, because we don't know if they were true or not, these relics. And to get the peasants to be impressed by him, he shows them these relics, and they'll have to pay in order to get a darshan, as it were, of the relic. So that's one thing. Another thing he does is that those who are afraid that when they die, they will, because of their sins in their lifetime, they will spend a lot of years of punishment in the afterlife without any chance of getting to heaven. The Christians at that time had this belief in purgatory, heaven, hell, purgatory. If you were a saintly person, zip, you go straight to heaven. If you are like you and me, some sins here and there, right? You go to purgatory, you have them washed away by some repentance and punishment and so on, many years maybe, and then maybe you can move up to heaven. And if you are pretty devilish and damned, straight to hell. Okay? The pardoner plays on this belief, and he says, you want to have shorter time in purgatory? You can pay the church some money. Just give it to me. And instead of 100 years in purgatory, 2 years, or whatever. So these were called indulgences. Indulgences. He sold indulgences. So the church is dirtying its hands with monetary transactions instead of a spiritual rethinking where you are sorry for your sins, you learn how to get rid of your sins, you are led by the priest towards a better life. You just pay the cash. So that spiritual thinking gets reduced to materialist thinking. Right? So we can talk about more of these examples more closely perhaps tomorrow, because I thought we'd look more at the text and the textual things tomorrow. But today I wanted to put it in context, as it were. So coming back to Wycliffe, this academic at Oxford, he said, don't believe in purgatory. It's not originally a Christian idea. Why might he say that? Because of the pardoner selling those sort of free tickets out of purgatory, those indulgences. He said pilgrimages are not necessary. They're not a good thing. He calls monks the pests of society, like rats or vermin of some kind. Enemies of religion and patrons and promoters of every crime. Monks, he says, are not holy. Friars, even worse, whose preaching is not according to the Bible, their preaching is not sincere, and what friars preach for is to get money. Wycliffe said those things. Chaucer hints at those things as well. So Chaucer's text is in tune with some of the criticism of the church at the time. Okay. Following Wycliffe, but not directly led by him, or he wasn't really part of them, but they sort of took off from him. Oops. These were kind of radical preachers who again wanted the church to be less rich and more concerned with the purity of religion as it used to be, and bringing the true word of God to the people. And they believed in preaching, walking barefoot, walking, no horses. The monk has a horse, many horses, right? We are told how often he goes hunting and so on. Walking from place to place and preaching the word of God simply to the people in English, without a license from the high-ups in the church, bishops. Radical ideas were getting spread by Lollards, preaching and going here and there. The established church, the ones who were happy in their wealthy abbeys and so on, did not like this radicalism. So they called Wycliffe a heretic, they called Lollards heretics, and they started burning them at the stake, especially just after Chaucer died, just after 1400. Wycliffe is revolutionary because he translates the Bible into English, and he says, let every man and woman be able to read it. The church was saying, nobody should be allowed to translate the Bible into English. Having the Bible in English will set Christian men at debate and turn subjects against their king. It will set Christian men at debate and turn subjects against their king. They feared discussion, debate, talking about religion, in case it led to some kind of revolutionary turn. So you have at least some ferment, some turmoil going on in society, some new ideas, people wanting to discuss and debate, and others wanting to clamp down on the debate. And it's in this circumstance, in this sort of situation, that Chaucer brings out his general prologue. Now, Chaucer may be, and probably is in my view, a sincere Christian, right? But a sincere Christian might say there's plenty to criticize. And let's see what's going on. Chaucer might be in favor of the court, the king, the political structure as it is, but he might have some criticisms of that. He won't tell you. He won't tell you. He allows the questions to come up, but he doesn't say what his position is. So it is a kind of text which is encouraging you to see and think, but not necessarily giving you answers. Right? So it's not like me lecturing, saying this is what it is, this is what it is, learn what it is. Chaucer does not give you one-way answers kind of thing. Okay. Wycliffe had said in 1382, he had a list of propositions or proposals, and among them was all the priests and clerics like monk, friar, should live in simplicity and poverty. Their lifestyle should be simple and poor, and all the goods of God should be in common. People should not hoard up private property and get rich. Similar idea you get in the other revolutionary thing that's happening at Chaucer's time, and that is the peasants' revolt. You MA students who have done the text, you've heard of this? Peasants' revolt. In 1377, 1378, I think, and 1381, the government had imposed new taxes on the people. And these were poll taxes, P-O-L-L, like you get today in polling booth and opinion poll and so on. It means by the head. So these taxes were per person. Every single person. You had a big family, you had to pay more because you had more people in the family, right? And when it was 1 shilling per person, 1 shilling is less than 1 rupee nowadays, but in those days it would probably buy a sheep or something. It was a lot of money. So the peasants did not want to pay it. And the peasants of the southeastern parts of England, Kent and near Canterbury, and the southern and eastern parts of England, which were quite prosperous, got together somehow without Facebook, without Twitter, without SMS, mobile phones. How did they coordinate? How did they get together? One critic I just was reading yesterday, he said, how did they do it? Maybe Lollard preachers going here and there, took the word or something. Anyway, they refused to pay, one group of them. And then the London authorities sent the authorities down to the villages saying, why have you not paid this tax? And the peasants said, tick, 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 cut their heads off and rebelled. And then that spread like that, and a great contingent of peasants came up to London and met the king, who was 14 years old at the time, and put their demands up to the king. Including redistributing the church lands among the poor, all lands should be held in common, various kind of quite radical things, a little bit like some of the things that Wycliffe was saying. And people should be free to go and seek work wherever work is available. They should not be tied to their villages. They wanted to get rid of the feudal restrictions on people's freedom, right? Like tying a villager to his village and so on. So they burnt the documents and records mention this revolt, except in one simile, when a whole lot of people are chasing after a fox which has stolen a chicken. It's the only mention in the Nun's Priest's Tale that Chaucer gives us of the Peasants' Revolt. Chaucer's not a poet who directly talks about events in his society like that. But I am suggesting that indirectly, some of this kind of new feeling of individual opinion, people of all ranks of society wanting to voice their views, people thinking that nowadays it's important to have more money, to get ahead, to rise up, to become a rank or two beyond what you were, aspiration. Isn't Chaucer reflecting that in the text of the general prologue? Yeah? We have the man of law, the lawyer, who is not only giving all his opinions in such a pompous and learned sound of voice, that he seemed busier than he was. He gives the impression of being a very important and busy man. He tries to impress. The second thing we hear about the lawyer is that he's very good at acquiring land. Land was difficult to buy and sell. Feudalism did not think of land as something you bought and sold. It's not a commodity for them. It's beginning to become a commodity. In feudal terms, you held land because your lord let you have some so that you owed him some service. That's gone. If you buy land, it's property. It's a commodity. The lawyer can get through all the feudal old laws and manage to get land like property, and nobody can point the finger at the legal deed or whatever it is. His purchase might not be in effect. Nobody could pick legal holes in his deal. He buys land, and he's becoming a grand gentleman. You enter the law profession, you become a grand gentleman. This is upward social mobility. And he's riding along side by side with a Franklin. What does Franklin mean? Franklin, anybody know? Even when we say be frank with me, it kind of means be free. Say what you really think. A Franklin is a free man. He's not a villain. He's not a bonded laborer of any kind. He doesn't owe services or duties to anybody. He's a free man. There were some in the beginning, and they became, some of them, quite wealthy. So he's like a country gentleman. And in the text, he's described as quite rich. And he is riding side by side with the lawyer. So they must have something in common. Maybe they're interested in becoming gentlemen, in getting a kind of gentrified status in society. Second point about the Franklin is he's criticized by some critics because he keeps a table ready in his hall all way. And in those days, a table was a board, a plank, this wide, on removable trestle legs. And when the meal was over, you took the plank off and propped it up against the wall, and you put the legs over there, and there was no table. The Franklin likes food so much that he keeps the table ready the whole time. And he's very hospitable, and he's compared to St. Julian, who was a saint who allowed everybody to come and eat. And the Franklin's very interested in food. What did he love? A sop of wine, some kind of wine and soaked bread and milk and sugar and things like that. He used to eat that a lot. So some critics have criticized him because he's interested in food. There's no mention of his interest in God, religion. Why is he on the pilgrimage? I don't find him that bad because something that's in the portrait is interesting. He's been a sheriff, a justice of the peace, some kind of legal accountant. He has done administrative duties. You can't run a country without people who can keep accounts and who can run the local law courts and administer justice in the local towns miles away from London. You need administrators. The Franklin is contributing to society in these duties and roles. And he was elected representative of his county, his region, in Parliament. He is not an aristocrat. He is only a free man who's come up a bit into money. So first he represents people coming up. Secondly, he represents possibly a new way of people doing their duty to society when they have come up. In that he is sheriff, counter, auditor, whatever it says. Thirdly, another change that's happening in society is that the knights, the ones who are the fighters on the horses, who go to the crusades and so on, are out of date. You don't need them. And it would be better if Chaucer's knight, instead of spending 30, 40 years abroad killing people, were actually back home helping to run the country in his local area. We know this because the government kept trying to persuade people, please become a knight. Because when they were knights, the government could then say, now you have to do these duties. You have to be sheriff, you have to administer this county, certain bureaucratic jobs. And the people would say, no, thank you. We don't want to become a knight. Duty, no thanks. And from 1291 or something, there was pressure from the government, please become a knight. Richard II, king, went to the citizens of London, who were merchants and rich businessmen, traders, and sitting in fine houses, and he said, you have to become knights, because he wanted them to do the work. And they said, no. So he said, then I will fine you. And they said, we won't pay the fine. So Richard is trying to get people to do these unpaid administrative duties under a kind of feudal thinking. You are a knight, you have to do duty. And the knights don't want to do it. Probably they like fighting instead. The merchants don't want to become knights because they're making money in their business. So you again have an interesting thing in Chaucer's general prologue. He has a knight who is old-fashioned, he's a fighter. No mention of him doing anything for government or society at home. You have a Franklin who's just a free man who's come up to a sort of gentlemanly status recently and who is contributing to government at home. Is that a sign of the old world changing and being replaced by the new world? We have this question by the monk. When the monk is in charge of a subsidiary monastery, there'd be the big abbey, the central monastery be in one place, but they would also own lands elsewhere, and they might have a sort of guest house or a few monks over there to run that farmland. And our monk is an outrider. He goes to these far-off places, and he stays there for a while may be in charge of 3 or 4 other monks then, keeper of the cell. When our monk is keeper of the cell, he allows the rules to relax. The discipline of being a monk. Get up at 3 a.m., go and say prayers, get up at 4 a.m., go and say more prayers, all of that. And he does it because he thinks it's old-fashioned. In medieval English, whereas this lord was keeper of the cell, the rule of Saint Moore or of Saint Bennet, by cause that it was old and some little straight, this ilke monk let all the things pass, and held after the newer world the sparse. In modern English, whenever this lord, this monk, was in charge of a subsidiary monastery, the rule of Saint Maurus or Saint Benedict, who set up the rule that monks had to obey, because it was old and a little bit strict, this same monk let the old ways drop and followed the new world for the time being. So while he was in charge, he followed the new world. So we have within the text the old world crumbling, disintegrating, changing, and we have the new world. Is it all bad, or is it good, or is Chaucer just saying, well, it's changing, I'm showing you how it's changing? The same monk says, if I labor with my hands, as Saint Augustine tells us we have to do, how shall the world be served? If I don't go out of my cloister, if I stay praying all night and day, how shall the world be served? Old thinking, monks are not supposed to serve the world. They serve by their prayer inside the monastery. New thinking, get out, do something more useful. Wycliffe. Monks are useless. So is Chaucer charting changes in his society? And he has people from non-traditional parts of society, not only a knight who's a fighter, and people from the church, those who pray, and a ploughman who's a peasant and who works with his hands, but many other middling people. More than any other poem of the time, he expands the middling people, the doctor, the captain, the wife of Bach, the miller, the reeve, and so on. He has many of those kind of people who are perhaps representing a new kind of middle class coming up, more rich, more independent, and more wanting to assert themselves in some way. And they all tell stories. So he lets all of them speak. And they speak in their stories when the actual storytelling starts up. And one story pleases one section of the people but annoys this section of the people. And then a story gets criticized by the listeners who don't like it. 2 of the stories are very boring. One of the very boring stories is told by Chaucer. That is one of the jokes. And, oh my God, shut up, please stop. The host has to come and so on. What is Chaucer saying? One size fits all? No. One story is not going to please everybody. People are now in different professions, ranks of society, different economic conditions, different outlook. They want different things. They're more individual, right? So you can't have an unchanging model of society like the old feudal thing. You have got a sort of dynamic model where people will object, protest, debate, question. Somebody tells a story on one theme, you don't like it, you tell another story, taking the opposite point of view. So that the whole Canterbury Tales that we have, 20 stories we have, he could never complete all the 80 he was planning. The stories themselves take different points of view, right? They debate and contest each other. The characters who tell the stories quarrel, fight, protest, comment. So you have a picture of a society that is thinking, that has got a buzz of new ideas. Okay? So in a sense, Chaucer is not openly radical in preaching what Wycliffe says or anything very dramatic like that. But he allows the new intellectual ferment to show, because he lets his characters say things and he lets there be a dialogue between different stories and different characters. So he shows you a society that is becoming more independent and intellectually engaged in different ways and taking different points of view. In a way, it's very liberal, as we say nowadays. It's very liberal to allow such a text, which actually has very rude stuff about friars and monks elsewhere in the stories, which are quite shocking, and we'd be thrown into jail if we said those things today. It is quite a liberal text. So some people now think that the court of Richard II, to which Chaucer's adult life belonged, was rather a liberal kind of court, and there was a clampdown outside the court by the church, and then that was followed by a bit of a clampdown, censorship and control of literature and so on by the next king later on, Henry IV. But there was a kind of window of liberal thinking to which it seems to me Chaucer belongs, and he might have been conservative himself, but allowing opinions to come up is something that he does. Now, I thought you might want me to shut up, and if you have any objections, complaints, or suggestions, what would be helpful. If you want to come tomorrow, what should I do? What would you be interested in? What would help you? And so on. That you can tell me, or you can ask any questions. Or you can say, how is this stupid text any use to us because we live in Kerala in 2017? What are the authorities doing telling us to read this book? You girls have to study it. You have to take an exam with this text quite soon.
Why is it relevant even today?
Well, don't we have social change today? Didn't Benston Sir just now talk about 40, 50 years ago when people wanted education as a kind of asset? And Chaucer is talking about a period where people are getting more education, demanding education, and the authorities are saying don't have education, it might lead to disturbance. The House of Commons, 1395, the peasants should not get themselves educated. All this reading and writing is not going to do them any good. So is education and debate and so on empowerment, or is it not? I'm trying to show you even today that this text itself seems to reflect a period of liberalizing thought where people begin to think more about matters which are important to them. In those days, the church in England and the wealth of the powers that be and the problems of the poor, those things. Maybe not exactly what we want to talk about now, but when we want to talk, is it a liberal atmosphere? Is it going to disturb some people? Are we going to be called Deshdrohi or heretics or whatever if we do talk? So Chaucer's circumstances might have some parallels with what we are seeing today. Plus, in India, in many places, is not so far from Chaucer's England, in that we've had a lot of economic liberalization, which has widened the gap between the rich and the poor like this since I've been in India. Right? When I first came, it was hard to get a car. There were very few cars on the road, can you imagine? Right? In Kerala you have lovely pakka houses, but the rest of India you don't have pakka houses half the time. And that even people who had a pakka house were general in the army or something, simple chairs like this, or fold-up chairs, or simple bit of furniture, not much furniture. We didn't have televisions. We didn't have telephones because you couldn't get a telephone connection. We certainly didn't have mobiles. People didn't take holidays. Right? You went to grandmother's house, maybe, that's it. You travel by bus. You know, that was in 1977 I first came. You can't believe the change in India. Money. Yeah? Sudden wealth. Chaucer. Wealth. People coming up. What does it do to society? What happens to the old idea of society where you contribute? And it's a unified whole with everybody doing his bit. Has it changed? So there are ways in which we can sort of say, he's trying to deal with some of the problems that we also see in our society. Individualism. You did not have it in India when I first came, in that arranged marriages were there, probably still are. You know, you belong to your caste or your community or your locality, and you were not supposed to do exactly what you wanted in choosing career or lifestyle and so on, clothes. Now there is more liberalization. So there's more individualism. What happens to society, good or bad? I think Chaucer's also showing you a time of change in his period, which we can say is a little bit making us think about what we have. Okay? There are some clues. We have plenty of religion in India. He's talking about a religion in a society which has a lot of religion in it. We also have that every day in our lives in different communities. We might see some parallels. Okay. Can I ask you, MA girls, when you study this text at MA, when you studied it, which text did you read? Do you read Chaucer in modern English? Do you not read a text at all? You take it from the internet, what do? You take the text from the internet. So you take a modernized text, or you take old text with modern English underneath? Old text and modern English underneath. Okay. And does the teacher teach when you have the text in front of you in the class? Yes? So you would say, let's look at the partner, and you look at the partner and you can discuss one particular passage. Is that useful? No, yes. Okay, well, we always have the exams, don't we? What about background notes to the text? Like information about partner, indulgences, pilgrimages, purgatory, whatever. Did you have that information? No. Okay. And you're going to do this exam, read the text yet? You haven't looked at it on your own. The teacher hasn't talked about it. And the exam is when? February? January? February. And you're going to have to go to the internet and not know which text is a good one. You're going to have to read the translation saying what is going on. So what can I do to help?
We just have a vague idea about the text.
Hmm?
We just have a vague idea about the text.
And that's going to get you 100%. Then?
It's not enough. We know that it's not enough.
Yeah.
We have to work on it.
Yeah, and in your library here, how many books do you have on Chaucer? This many, this many, this many? Okay, right. One thing that I talked to Ashley, sir, about was, since I have edited the general prologue, would it be useful to have some copies in your library? And Dayapuram said that they would kindly buy the books, not from me because I don't own the book, the publisher owns it, but I got from the publisher some copies. So, this is me. This is the Peasants' Revolt, and this is King Richard in the middle talking to them. And there is introduction, which says some of the things I've been saying today, Black Death, Peasants' Revolt, this, that, and why it might be important. And then, this might be too much of a good thing. I have not given the modern translation. So if it is too tough for you, this might be something you just dip into, you don't necessarily read through. I've given a Chaucer's medieval English, Middle English here, a little sign by each difficult word, and then the difficult words right there in the margin. Okay? And on the left-hand side, because there's a lot of information you need on this text, is line by line any background information you need. So even if you find this a little bit tough, I don't know if it's too tough for you, this side information may be useful. If you have the modern type of text, right, and you go through each character, this may help you. So if you want to have this, we'll see if we can get Ashley to put some in the library. And at the back, this is for university students. You're university students, right? The most straightforward and useful kind of extracts from critics or full essays from critics, not too difficult. Read whatever is useful. So we'll try and do that. But for tomorrow, we have another class. I can bring you, if they would Xerox it for me, a few pages, and we can look at this character or that character. And as we look at it, we can see how Chaucer is working, what he is doing, and what would connect with what I said today. Would that work, do you think? Are you allowed to say no? Yeah? Anything else you want to say? Did you have a recording? I think you can, I haven't got one. I've only got me and I'm not that good. You might be able to get on the internet, I don't know. Listen to a recording. Okay. I think you leave, you think, you can talk to me, you can talk to me before the next class, you can say a bit more of this, a bit less of that. We didn't understand this bit, it was quite boring. The best thing that Chaucer's ever said, and he said it 3 or 4 times, was, let me see if I can remember it. He that preacheth to him that listeth not hearing him, his sermon hem annoyeth, which in modern English is, he that preaches to those who don't want to listen to him, his speech bugs them. Yes? So Chaucer knew that if you were not interested, it was very boring. I hope it's not too boring.
No, it was interesting.
Okay, and if you want to help me make it better and more useful, you tell me what I can do. All right? Okay, thank you.